Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the world to the Enlightenment Podcast. There is lots to talk about in general and humanity, and especially at this time, we feel that in our season one, it's very important to have a dialogue about Palestine, to build awareness, to give some context, context that's sometimes been missing from mainstream coverage, and to reach as many people as possible. Today, this is episode 6, so please go back and check our earlier episodes if you haven't. Today, we're going to be talking about a few different things, but mostly focused on the First Intifada, which is the Palestinian uprising, which happened in December 1987, and then the Second Intifada in September 2000. So let's jump right in. Hanan, tell us a little bit about what led to these uprisings.
Yes, as you mentioned, Shamim, in previous episodes, we covered Jewish Zionism and their detailed plan to take over Palestine from the indigenous Palestinian people.
Yeah, which started, by the way, in the late 19th century with Theodor Herzl, a self-proclaimed atheist who was the founder, nevertheless, of Jewish Zionism.
That's right. And we talked about the Palestinian revolt in the 1930s and the various Zionist massacres against the Palestinians throughout.
Yeah, and I just wanted to chip in to say those massacres are very well documented for anybody who would like to look them up. We mentioned some sources in our last one, but do that.
Yeah, and we also covered the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948, with over 750,000 Palestinians ethnically cleansed and forced out of their homes. We also covered the Naksa in 1967, again with over 300,000 Palestinians forced to leave their home and ethnically cleansed. And as you mentioned, Shamim, context is very important in everything. So it's very important to give the Palestinians historical context, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think without the historical context, people seem to find it sometimes hard to understand what's going on with Palestinians and what's happening today, or they feel that it's complicated.
Yeah. And we also talked about Arab Jews. They were part of the social fabric. They lived, they thrived, they prospered for centuries as citizens in the Arab world and also in the Muslim world, in Turkey and Iran, where they some of them still live. Really, the issue has always been that the Zionist as a political ideology, and it was never the issue with Judaism and the Jewish people and their religion.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is not, as you say, religion. The issue is that they are settler colonialists.
Yeah, exactly. And ironically, in Christian Europe, we mentioned Jews were attacked for being Jewish, but in the Arab and Muslim world, that wasn't the case.
Yeah. So just to go back to this idea of that's often peddled that Palestinians are inherently somehow anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. Just to be clear, if Hindus or people from any other religion came over to Palestine as colonists, as colonizers, to take over the land without reparations and without asking permission, and often illegally, regardless of religion, indigenous Palestinian people would presumably have an issue with anybody colonizing their land.
Yeah, very much so. Sorry to interrupt. And unlike the Zionist propaganda, the Hasbara, it's never been about anti-Semitism. I mean, we, the Palestinians, we're Semitic. So it's always been about anti-settler colonialists, and regardless of their religion, as you mentioned. And in Palestine, except for a few thousand native Palestinian Jews, 99.9% of Jews in Israel are settler colonialists who are not indigenous to Palestine.
Yeah, and they continue to this day, at this moment, to colonize, by taking land illegally without reparations, as I said, or giving Palestinians the right of return, which is legally theirs under the UN. And I keep banging on about this point because when people say to me, well, Israel is fighting terrorism, they're also colonizing land illegally and continuing to do so, which has nothing to do with anything. It has to do with ethnic cleansing. Anyway, that's me on my soapbox. It's a very difficult time today, 20th October. Northern Gaza is being cut out of any communications and cleansed. The First Intifada, let's go back, Hanan, but the Palestinian uprising against the Zionist occupation started in December 1987, and it lasted around 6 years, till September 1993.
Yeah, and it was brutal. And just to go back for a bit of context, the Zionist Project of Israel, the occupier, chose to occupy Palestine, and it was full of indigenous people. So it wasn't something that happened as a result of the Palestinian revolt, it was the other way around.
Yeah. And as a reminder, again, the Zionists did start colonizing Palestine well over half a century before the Holocaust started. And by the way, the archives of the Haganah, which is the Jewish terror group that was established before the Nakba to start cleansing the land of Palestinians, those archives give great detail about the consultancy, which was led by David Ben-Gurion, and their very long seminar as one of their key meetings. These are all key moments where ethnic cleansing objectives were talked about and agreed. Denin, one of the people involved, quoted Ben-Gurion as saying, "Every village should be occupied and destroyed."
Yeah, and they had a very detailed plan to evict the indigenous Palestinians from their land and to replace them with Jewish Europeans as settler colonialists.
Yeah. So we had the Nakba, then we had the Six-Day War in 1967, and we had the Naksa, where another big slew of Palestinians had to leave. And as a reminder, that war was started by the Israelis. The Israelis ended up illegally taking over and occupying the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights in Syria, and the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt.
Yeah, and I also wanted to mention that even before the 1967 war in June and the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, full-scale Israeli incursions were taking place into the Palestinian territory. So even before they officially occupied, if you like.
Yeah. Yeah. One example, on the 13th of November 1966, 7 months before the Six-Day War, there was a full incursion from the Israeli occupying forces into the village of Samu.
Yeah, and that was near Hebron in the West Bank. Yeah.
And they mobilized around 4,000 Israeli forces backed by tanks and aircraft for this village.
Yeah, and they called this Operation Shredder, if you like. That was the code name for it.
Lovely. Well, that gives you a sign. They ordered the town's residents to the town square. They blew up and destroyed 125 houses. They destroyed the village's medical clinic, a 6-classroom school, a workshop, a mosque, a police station, and a flour mill.
Yeah, and now we're seeing it at a large scale happening, but that's just one of many examples, and that was 1966.
Yeah. The UN censured Israel on that occasion, I think, for violating the United Nations Charter and the General Armistice Agreement. And the UN issued the United Nations Security Council Resolution 228.
That's right. The thing is, I think using kind of might, dominance, and hegemony never really works. I mean, we see it, it's been happening now for almost 100 years. And it's been really the playbook of the Zionist colonialists when they officially started towards the end of the 19th century. And it hasn't stopped. We see it continue today. And really crushing to control the indigenous Palestinian people through force and supremacy will never work long term. Not with Palestinians, not with anyone else in general, but it's been happening to Palestinians now for some time.
Yeah, it feels antithetical to everything that is humanist, which is what we're all about on this podcast, rather than religious or one side or the other. Anyway, let's get back to we were talking about the incursions that led to the 1967 occupation, and eventually we're going to get to the Intifadas.
Yeah. And as a result of this brutal occupation, if you like, of Palestine by the Zionist occupying forces, and their use of military rule over the Palestinians, which we talked about in a previous episode, and continuously tightening the hold on Palestinians, and also building and expanding illegal settlements, and at the same time denying the indigenous Palestinian people their basic human rights.
Yeah, okay, but I know we're going to talk about settlements separately, but I was surprised just recently to find out that settlements grew significantly under the Labour government, which was that like not supposed to be a more left-wing government?
Yeah.
So basically the settlements did not stop regardless of whoever was in power.
Exactly.
So the settlements springing up everywhere, Palestinians really being treated as second-class citizens or illegally occupied. Let's go back to the First Intifada.
Yeah. So when I think, again, we need to know that when any power continues to ethnically cleanse and to subjugate an indigenous people, as in the case of Palestinians, and when we see the Israeli occupying forces treating the Palestinians as subjects and not as humans, and trying to really beat them into submission under an illegal occupation, people will naturally rise. Nobody will just sit still.
Yeah, that's the thing. It doesn't come out of the blue. And I think the context is very important. The uprising was motivated by a collective, very cruel treatment of Palestinians by the Zionist military occupation in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in East Jerusalem.
Yeah, and it still is, actually. It was a brutal occupation for over half a century. It's really the world's largest occupation, and the world's finally seeing it. And the brutality, and with the continued repression and killings of Palestinians throughout the occupation. It never stopped. So the Palestinians did finally rise against their occupiers.
Yeah, I don't care where you are. If people come into your house or into your country and brutally try to take over, you're going to fight back. If it's at all possible. It's impossible not to.
Yeah, no one really can take it. Eventually people just say enough is enough. And with the continued brutal Zionist occupation, repression, it really was unbearable for the Palestinians.
Well, we talk about this repression in kind of big terms like repression, but can you give us a couple of examples of this collective punishment?
Yeah, where do I start, really? I mean, from beatings, curfews, house demolitions, uprooting olive trees, which is very important to Palestinians and Palestinian culture, expropriation of Palestinian land, building illegal settlements, which we talked about, extended imprisonments, detentions without trial, shootings, killings, deportations, and really it's a very, very long list, all very well documented.
Yeah, exactly. If anybody wants to look them up, or check out social media. I just posted something today from the rabbis against Zionism, who are helping to try to protect some of the few farmers who are still able to try and harvest their olives at this time in the West Bank, and who are just being aggressed horribly by the colonialist Zionist forces, but also by the settlers with impunity. Anyway, back to the time of the First Intifada. This started 8th of December 1987. The illegal occupation of Palestine was going on for around 20 years at that time. And that's the 67 borders being illegally taken. And Zionist policy at that time was to rule the Palestinians with what they called an iron fist policy, which is an actual policy.
Yeah, it is. And it was known as the Operation Iron Fist. I mean, I don't know where they come up with the names. And it was really named at crushing any resistance of the indigenous Palestinian people. But this crushing continues. And now we're seeing it, sadly, again, against the Lebanese people as well as the Palestinians at the same time.
Yeah, and let's remember, speaking of Lebanon, when the Israeli occupying forces invaded Lebanon first in 1978, that invasion killed around 2,000 Lebanese and Palestinians. And when I say killed it, the Israeli occupying forces killed them, and they displaced around 250,000 people. And at that time, the UN Security Council adopted resolutions 425 and 426, that's in March 1978, asking Israel to immediately withdraw its troops from Lebanon.
Yeah, and also the Israeli occupying forces in June 1982 invaded Lebanon again, and this was known as the Second Israeli Invasion of Lebanon, and they continued to occupy southern Lebanon until around 2000 for almost 18 years of occupation.
Yeah, and this time around 50,000 Palestinians and Lebanese civilians were killed and wounded, and another 6,000 were missing.
Yeah, and I want to mention the Sabra and Shatila massacres because they definitely caused an outrage, rightly so. But this came about as the involvement of the Israeli occupying forces. And those massacres really were perpetrated by the phalangists while the Israeli forces were sort of guarding and standing watch and enabling it to happen.
Mm. And just for those who don't know these massacres, the Israeli forces had surrounded Beirut's Sabra, which was a mainly Palestinian neighborhood, which is adjacent to the Shatila refugee camp, where Palestinian refugees were living.
Yeah, and these same Palestinians really who were ethnically cleansed from Palestine and who end up as refugees in Lebanon. So they've already been, they've become refugees. And we, in an earlier episode, we mentioned how the Palestinians sort of ended up in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, the West Bank, Gaza, in refugee camps all over, as well as in the diaspora.
So the Sabra and Shatila massacre, and we say it was a massacre because it was not an even fight. It was just a massacre. It took place from the 16th to the 18th of September, 1982, and around 3,500 Palestinians and Lebanese Shias were massacred in cold blood.
Yeah, and as if that wasn't enough, there was another attack on Lebanon by the Israeli occupying forces in 2006, killing over 1,300 Lebanese civilians, displacing, and also at the same time displacing over 1 million Lebanese. And while they did that, of course, they severely damaged all the sort of Lebanese infrastructure.
Yeah, and now it's happening again on an even bigger scale in Lebanon, with currently, I think, 1.2 million people estimated to be displaced, and no sign of this madness stopping.
Yeah, and we'll do a future episode on Lebanon. We'll invite my dear friend Amal, who lives right now in Beirut and with her family. So, yeah.
Right, I'm looking forward to all of these. So, the occupation continued to crush Palestinians and displace and uproot them, forced evacuations, and of course, preventing them from the right of return. Nobody has been able to return yet.
Yeah, and still, I mean, these are central to the lived reality of Palestinians, really.
Yeah, including your mom, which we've talked about in the first couple of
That's right.
episodes here. And meanwhile, the illegal settlements in what remained of Palestine doubled at this time, from 35,000 settlers in 1948 to 64,000 in 1988. So a relatively small rise in that period. And then it got to 130,000 illegal settlers by the mid-90s. Where are we now on the settler count?
We're close to 1 million settlers living illegally on Palestinian land, unfortunately.
Yeah, and there are new settlements being announced all the time. It is a very organized takeover of the last remaining slivers of Palestinian land. So left unchecked, settlements are continuing to grow, which is, again, hard to justify with the, sorry, I'm going to say it, propaganda that calls all of this self-defense. It is not self-defense. It's an illegal takeover.
Yeah, it's definitely not self-defense. It's always been part of the Zionist plan from the beginning to continue to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from their land and to create a Jewish majority in Palestine.
Yeah, and again, look up Theodore Herzl in his own words. Please listen to David Ben-Gurion, and I quote some of his quotes about ethnic cleansing and the necessity for it in episode 5. Now, the world is seeing all of this. They're talking about settling in Gaza and Lebanon, the occupiers. And recently, on the 19th of July, 2024, the International Courts of Justice reaffirmed and ruled that Israel's settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem are illegal and unlawful under international law.
Yes, and they also called for Israel to end its illegal occupation, to stop the settlement activities, and also to evacuate the settlers out.
Yeah, and that including the illegal segregation wall, which again violates international law and was built in 2000 and finished in February 2005.
Yeah, and it also violates the human rights of Palestinians, including the right to move freely, to have access to education and healthcare. And we'll talk about that in another episode, probably the next one.
Yeah. So just to clarify here, the UN, the International Committee of the Red Cross, many other international parties have all affirmed that the occupation and also the Zionist settlements violate international law, specifically Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Palestinians have also a recognized right under international law to resist Israeli occupation under Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions. People seem to forget this because they behave as if Palestinian resistance happens in a vacuum, but it's not. It's happening under an illegal occupation, and there is a right to resist. The United Nations General Assembly has expressly affirmed this right, again, of Palestinians to resist Israeli military occupation.
Yeah, and the settlements are a war crime under international law, as you mentioned, and resisting the occupation is allowed under international law.
Okay. So, sorry, I went off piece a little bit, but let's
Okay.
go back. Years of ruthless campaigns against the Palestinians under the illegal occupation, demolishing their homes, crushing those who tried to resist the occupation, led to this First Intifada or uprising.
Yeah, yeah. And that really was triggered by a Zionist driver. He collided, or they collided with a civilian car, and they killed 4 Palestinian workers.
Okay, so 3 of these workers were from the Jabalia, yeah, Jabalia refugee camp. So this
Yes,
was in Gaza.
in Gaza, yes, in Gaza, and the Palestinians believe that was a deliberate attack. It was.
Okay, and Jabalia in Gaza is the largest of the 8 refugee camps in Gaza. And in the last episode, we mentioned that out of the 2.3 Palestinians living in Gaza, who used to live in Gaza, we don't know how many are left. Around 1.8 of those Palestinians, 1.8 million, are refugees who've come from both the Nakba of 1948, the Naksa of 1967 from other parts of Palestine. So they have been displaced many, many times over.
Yeah, that's correct. And after the killings of those workers, there was a mass protest and civil disobedience that erupted and led to violence. But the occupying forces sent, I think, over 80,000 soldiers to brutally crush the riots.
Yeah, so this is really, I think what we're seeing today is a similar thing, excessive use of lethal force. At that time, not as bad, including tear gas, firing on Palestinians with live ammunition. And all of this was criticized by international agencies like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, other organizations. But let's just dial back a year before this first Intifada started. On the 4th of December 1986, there were mass demonstrations, were there?
Yeah, yeah. And what caused it is that 2 university students at Birzeit University were shot and killed on campus. And they were killed by the Zionist occupying forces, soldiers, obviously. And that caused a mass demonstration.
Yeah, and I think your dad's cousins were university professors at Birzeit. Am I right?
Yeah, that's good. So Auntie Madeleine's daughters, Jano and Hind, my dad's cousins from Bethlehem, were university professors at Birzeit University.
Okay, so 2 students shot and killed by soldiers. So demonstrations erupted naturally, and the Israeli occupiers responded with very harsh punitive measures, systematic beatings of handcuffed Palestinian youths, rubber bullets, live ammunition, arrest, and deportations. Obviously, all of this to intimidate activists from continuing to activate.
Yeah, and as part of the collective punishment of Palestinians, because the Israeli occupying forces use that a lot, collective punishment. Schools were closed for 12 months in the West Bank. Excuse me, universities were forced to close down on and off throughout most of the Intifada. And on top of this, the curfews, the ambushing and killing of Palestinian children and adults were sadly a daily part of Palestinian existence under the military occupation.
Yeah, and I think also the Palestinian communities were cut off from water supplies, from electricity, from fuel. These are just basics. Of course, you're going to get upset if this happens and you're seeing, kids being beaten up on the street. All the killings continued, and the majority of those killed were during the demonstrations and the riots. Is that correct?
That's correct. And just to go back a bit, we mentioned how important it is for the Palestinian community, the closeness, the interaction, the generosity, the warmth. And so really, I just want to go back to stress that Palestinians have the right to resist under international law, even though the propaganda and Hasbara make it as if they don't, but they do. And they have the right to resist against the illegal occupation. And that also includes armed resistance, obviously not against civilians, but armed resistance in general against occupier.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, the iron fist policy that we were talking about, it didn't really work. It never does, it never will. The Palestinians rose up against their illegal occupiers.
Yeah, and that uprising continued, as we said, for 6 years, which is a very long time. And over 1,000 Palestinians were killed, 240 children, thousands and thousands were wounded, put in prison and detention centers for a very long time.
Yeah. So the First Intifada started as a mass civilian-based resistance against the occupation.
Yeah, and it also involved every Palestinian city, town, village, refugee camp. So if you like, all the Palestinians were involved in this against this illegal, brutal occupation, from women, men, children, adults, academics, merchants, workers, basically the whole strata of Palestinian society.
Yeah, but they didn't have weapons during the First Intifada. I think maybe in the second they had more. But so Palestinians resisted it during this First Intifada by civil disobedience, from demonstrations, as you said, general strikes. They refused to pay taxes. They boycotted Israeli products, and they threw stones and Molotov cocktails when they could, and burnt tires and tried to erect barricades to hold back the movement of the Israeli occupying forces.
Yeah, and they used excessive force to crack down on Palestinians even harder. And the Israeli Zionist colonies' international reputation, if you like, started to deteriorate because the world started seeing the brutality, and you see these images of young boys throwing rocks at these tanks and big military machines.
Yeah. And in the meantime, there were the Madrid talks going on, and then the Oslo Accords between the PLO and Arafat on the one side and the Israelis on the other. And I think those were signed in September 1993. And the Oslo Accords agreed to discuss the elements of a future Palestinian state based on the Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. Can you just tell us what that involved? Was there a Palestinian state at stake here?
Yeah, I mean, these agreements did not even uphold Palestinian self-determination or statehood. So they were just, yeah.
Yeah, well, but another surprise for me, because when it's sold to you on mass media, you're understanding that this Oslo Accord is supposed to provide a framework for peace between the Israelis and Palestinians.
Yeah, I mean, that's the joke. If you look deeper, it's the so-called peace agreements that they keep saying the Palestinians aren't accepting. They were open-ended agreements. They weren't really anywhere near where they needed to be.
Yeah, and I guess better people than I have said that they would have placed Palestinians in the role of human supplicants. And Noam Chomsky, the Columbia University author, professor, described the Oslo Agreement. He said, and I quote, "It allows Israel to do virtually what it likes," end quote.
Yeah, yeah. And Oslo really showed that the Zionists were not really planning on giving the Palestinians their independence, their sovereignty, their self-determination, their statehood. It was all just intended to prolong and maintain the colonial Zionist occupation, and to give them time to continue to expand and build further illegal settlements, while at the same time trying to get Palestinians to accept a less than a state, if you like.
Mm. And I love quoting the people involved, because there's no clearer source than that in a way. It's not up for interpretation. But before Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated in 1995, and he was the Israeli leader at the time of the Oslo Accords, he said at the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, we would like this entity to be less than a state.
Yeah.
So that seems to pretty much hold up what you just said.
Very much so. And also and at the same time, a state where the Zionist colony would control everything, the import, the export, the entry, the exit of all of it, which has been happening, and it has continued to happen, but it's kind of a state.
Yeah, which is a Bantustan solution. Let's go back to South Africa. There's one state and there's one Bantustan, which is controlled by that state, not a two-state solution. And Rabin again confirmed it with another quote saying, "We will not return to the 4th of June 1967 lines," which they knew they had contravened illegally.
Yeah, exactly. So the Palestinians would really end up with even less than the 20% of historic Palestine. And let's not forget that the UN, when they decided to partition Palestine, a country that did not belong to them in the first place, they assigned 56% of historic Palestine to the Zionists. But in 1948, when the Zionists sort of end up taking 78% of historic Palestine, yeah.
So, and that was again, despite the United Nations ruling. So really from day one of the creation of Israel, it's been taking more land than was ever assigned to it.
Yeah. And also the Oslo Accords end up creating a sort of a Palestinian national authority with limited self-governance and also governance over some parts of the West Bank and Gaza. So it's really more like outsourcing the occupation, and yeah.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it, but it is actually a far cry from Palestinian statehood and independence. Again, we can perhaps cover this with one of our guests later on what the differences are, because people think of Palestine as sometimes having elections, but they're all within a very specific framework.
Very much so, and they kind of turned the Palestinian leadership into policemen for them, and not as an independent Palestinian state with full rights.
Mm. And Oslo, I think, also legitimized the fragmentation of the Palestinian population, and we're going to discuss this and apartheid in our next episode. So let's move to the Second Intifada. So the first one, civil resistance, a lot, throwing rocks. What was the Second Intifada about? It started September 2000 and ran for over 4 years.
Yeah, till February 2005. So it was the failure of the Camp David talks in July 2000 between Yasser Arafat and Ehud Barak under Clinton. And it was the failure to reach a two-state solution. So yeah, that failure led to the Second Intifada. But really, the First Intifada never really finished, was kind of rolling over. But yeah, that's the official date, if you like.
Yeah, and this so-called roadmap, which was aimed at this two-state solution, this mythical two-state solution, ended up in a cycle similar to Oslo. There was never really any real intention, I think, when you look back at that, of Palestinians being able to get their own state all the time. As you said, during this, heavily armed settlers were being placed all over the land that was supposed to form part of this two-state, so it doesn't show goodwill.
No, not at all. And during the Second Intifada, again, over 3,200 Palestinians were killed. But in future episodes, we'll invite my cousin, Victor Kattan, who's a professor and author of many, many books on Palestine, and he can discuss in more detail because he's the expert. But basically, the injustice against the Palestinians has been going on for almost 100 years, and it's still live and going. And the resistance of the Palestinians, again, in both intifadas was crushed and continues to be crushed today, as we're seeing it unfold in both the West Bank and Gaza.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, I think the mainstream Western media does like to frame this as a war, but it's really not symmetrical. We're seeing, everybody can see this now on social media. We're witnessing it daily, the injustice committed, and the fight has never really been equal on both sides. On one side, we have an occupier with the latest equipment, technology, intelligence, training from the biggest army in the West, and they have an army, air force, and navy, and the other side does not.
Yeah, exactly. So one side is a colonizing force that continuously and violently terrorizes and brutalizes and aims to subjugate the Palestinian people. And at the same time, they try to have them live under the boot of the occupying colonial Israeli authorities. And while at the same time continuing to expel Palestinians and towards ethnically cleansing them out of Palestine.
Yeah. So again, this has been going on one way or the other for the past 77 years, and now we're seeing this happen in Lebanon, where certainly the far right element in Israel is talking about colonizing Lebanon imminently. There are over 160 countries in the world, Hanan, who are supportive of the Palestinians.
Yeah. And we've seen students around the world be sort of speaking out, but sadly they've been put down, if you like, their demonstrations and so on by their governments and by various institutions and universities, and just for protesting and for advocating for a permanent ceasefire.
Yeah, it feels to me like a very big assault on free speech, to threaten people with not getting their degrees or being thrown out of their universities. for me, student power is a long noble pursuit from Vietnam, you name it. Anyway, there's power in that movement. And I think younger generations are educating themselves through alternative media. This doesn't mean conspiracy theory media. It just means that they're not being taking for granted the PR that's sometimes coming across on larger outlets. And if sometimes that PR is only by omission, what they choose not to cover. For example, this morning's closing off of northern Gaza and evidence of ethnic cleansing that is coming out.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, Israel, as I said earlier, Israel has been ethnically cleansing and slowly killing Palestinians over the years since they sort of started colonizing. And really, they keep expecting the Palestinians to be the quiet victims, if you like. So, but I think the veil has been finally sort of dropping and exposed, and now the global majority are seeing the reality of what's been going on, and how the Palestinians have been treated, and the brutality of living under a Zionist occupation, military occupation.
Yeah, and it's not to be anti-Western for the sake of it. We live here, we have many freedoms and things that we enjoy about living in the West. There's a lot to be grateful and impressed by, but I think Western media and Western leaders, by not listening to the majority of their people, are eroding their credibility. On the one hand, they claim to believe in the freedom of speech. On the other hand, in our industry, entertainment industry, as in many others, they are suppressing pro-Palestinian voices and support. There is definitely a sense of being keep quiet or take a consequence.
Yeah, and not only that, actually, the irony is when Western powers claim that they believe in international law and order, but yet when it comes to Israel, they continue to offer diplomatic, military cover and support to the Zionist colony of Israel, no matter what. And even as we're seeing, when they're committing crimes, atrocities, and genocide, they still give them cover and arms and support.
Yes, and the sad thing is there is a power available to stop the arms if there are atrocities being committed. So it's really a litmus test on where governments stand, on where people stand, and on where humanity stands. To me, I don't know.
Yeah.
Let's move on to something a slightly more internal. In the last episode, you briefly mentioned sumud, a Palestinian word which means resilience.
Yeah, yeah. So I mentioned that the Zionist occupation is the longest we've seen today. But as the Palestinians continue to endure the dispossession, the destruction of their communities and their societies, so that ongoing oppression has inspired intergenerational Palestinians and Palestinian sumud, which is steadfastness and resilience.
Yeah, I love that word. And I love words, being a writer, and the fact that there's often not just one word which says it all. So Samud, as I understand it, there's also a sense of rootedness in the land. It's the olive trees. It's everything that is important for Palestinians, part of Palestinian indigenousness and their connection to the land. And around Bethlehem, where your family is from, there are so many beautiful green spaces. That do not exist anymore because settlements have just been thrown up, and Roman olive trees that belong to people, farmers' olive trees, have been uprooted without a second thought. And these are trees that were there from the time that Jesus walked that land.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. I think people don't kind of connect, but and really the love of the land of the indigenous Palestinian people is really unparalleled. And despite sort of continuously trying to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians away from their land, and despite trying to kind of destroy our Palestinian culture, our shared collective memories and history, and despite trying to erase our identity, Palestinians will always have sumud.
Yeah. Israel's founding leader, David Ben-Gurion, said, "The old will die and the young will forget." What do you have to say about that?
Actually, it's the young who will never forget. And Palestinians are very much rooted in their land. And every Palestinian, whether in Palestine or in the diaspora, they're resilient, really. And And really, I mean, the Zionist propaganda and narrative has been and continues to be focused on the Israelis being the victims, which is really something else.
Yeah. And again, just to reiterate, under international law, Palestinians have the right to return back to their homes and their land. You cannot just throw people out.
Yeah. I mean, Palestinians will always hold on to that right of return to their homeland, and they'll always demand to live with dignity like any other people in the world, like any other human beings.
Yeah. Shall we call that day? If we have any questions or topics for us to cover, just let us know. Drop us a note in our comments. Our next episode will be covering apartheid, not South African apartheid, but apartheid under the Zionist regime. If you enjoyed this episode, please do like it. Please do subscribe. Please do share with your friends, as it helps with spreading the word, helps with the algorithm. And our aim for doing this podcast is to bring our point of view of humanism to as many people as possible. I try not to editorialize. I'm sorry I maybe did a bit, but it was very upsetting waking up to images of long rows of Palestinians, men, women, and children being lined up by Israelis to be killed this morning in northern Gaza.
Yeah, it's brutal. But as always, we believe that stories matter, representation matters. And just to say thank you for taking the time to watch. Please remember to like and to share, and see you in the next episode.